I had built the company from nothing, and they tried to take it from me in front of 12 witnesses on a Thursday morning in October. The boardroom was on the 43rd floor of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, all polished walnut and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a postcard, and I sat at the end of that long table knowing exactly what was about to happen because I had seen the signs for months. The company was mine in every way that mattered. I had founded it 7 years earlier with $50,000 in personal savings and a business plan I wrote on my kitchen table, built it into a $120 million enterprise software firm with 300 employees and contracts with 11 Fortune 500 companies. But on paper, I owned only 42% of the equity. The rest was held by venture capital firms, early investors, and a man named Richard Grayson who sat at the opposite end of the table that morning with a leather portfolio in front of him and a smile that made my stomach turn. Richard was the lead partner at Grayson Ventures, the Series B investor who had put in $18 million years earlier when we needed capital to scale. And he had spent every board meeting since then positioning himself as the strategic visionary while subtly undermining my authority in front of the other directors. He never contradicted me directly, he just asked questions, patient, pointed questions that implied I didn't understand finance, didn't understand market dynamics, didn't understand how to run a company at scale. And the other board members, 3 men from different VC firms, 1 independent director who was a former CFO at a public tech company, and our general counsel who reported to me but always seemed to align with Richard, listened to him as though he were the adult in the room and I were a child playing entrepreneur. The meeting started at 9 sharp. Richard opened by congratulating the team on a strong third quarter, then pivoted immediately to concerns about fourth quarter projections and long-term growth strategy. He used phrases like execution risk and leadership bandwidth and scalability challenges, and every phrase was aimed at me. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew he was questioning whether I was capable of leading the company through its next phase. Then he moved to the agenda item I had been dreading, a proposal to bring in a new chief executive officer with operational experience at scale while transitioning me into a chief product officer role focused on innovation and vision. He framed it as a natural evolution, a way to let me focus on what I did best while bringing in someone with the expertise to manage a more complex organization. He even said it would be better for me, less stress, more time to think strategically. The other board members nodded. No one asked me what I thought, no one asked if I agreed. Richard simply presented the proposal as though it were a foregone conclusion, then looked at me with that same patronizing smile and asked if I had any questions. I did not have questions. I had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. I knew Richard had been recruiting CEO candidates behind my back. I had confirmation from 2 separate executive search firms who had reached out to people in my network asking about the company and the board dynamics. I knew he had been meeting privately with the other board members, building consensus for a leadership change without ever inviting me into the conversation. I knew he had positioned himself as the reasonable, experienced voice of fiscal responsibility while painting me as passionate but inexperienced, creative but operationally weak. A founder who had taken the company as far as she could but now needed to step aside for professional management. And I knew that if I let this meeting end without a response, I would walk out of that boardroom as a chief product officer in title and a figurehead in practice, watching someone else run the company I had built while Richard and his allies controlled every strategic decision. So I did not ask questions. I made a single statement. I said that I appreciated the board's feedback, that I understood the concerns about scale and execution, and that I would take the weekend to consider the proposal. Then I asked to table the vote until the following week's meeting. Richard looked surprised. The other board members looked relieved. No one wants to fire a founder in real time, especially when she built the company and still owns a significant equity stake. They agreed to reconvene the following Thursday, and the meeting adjourned at 10:15. I did not go back to my office. I went directly to the parking garage, got in my car, and drove to a coffee shop 3 miles away where no one from the company would see me. I sat in a corner booth with my laptop and a notebook, and I began to map out every lever I had, every relationship, every piece of information, and every structural advantage I could deploy in the next 7 days. I was not going to argue with Richard. I was not going to appeal to the board's sense of fairness or loyalty. I was going to execute a strategy so precise that by the time they realized what was happening, it would be irreversible. The first step was to understand the board composition and voting dynamics. I had 42% of the equity, which translated to 42% of the board votes under our shareholder agreement. Richard's firm held 18%. The other 3 VC firms held 12%, 9%, and 7% respectively. The independent director had no equity but 1 board seat with voting rights equivalent to 5%. Our general counsel was a non-voting observer. That meant I needed to secure at least 9 additional percentage points to reach 51% and control the vote. I had 7 days to do it. I started with the smallest VC firm, the one that held 7%. They were an early-stage fund based in San Francisco, led by a woman named Angela Cortez who had invested in our Series A and had always been supportive but relatively passive on the board. I called her that afternoon and asked if we could meet in person. She agreed, and I flew to San Francisco the next morning. We met at her office on Saturday afternoon, and I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her exactly what Richard was planning, not the CEO transition, but the long-term play. I explained that once I was moved into a CPO role, Richard would push for an acquisition within 18 months, selling the company to a larger enterprise software firm where he had relationships and positioning himself as the architect of a successful exit. I showed her the data, comparable acquisitions in our space over the past 3 years, the typical valuation multiples, and the timeline from leadership transition to sale. Then I showed her what that meant for returns. An acquisition at current multiples would give her fund a 4.2x return on their investment. If we stayed independent, executed the growth plan I had built, and took the company public in 3 years, her fund would see a 12x return. I had the financial models. I had the market analysis. I had the roadmap. And I had one more thing, a commitment. If she voted with me to reject the CEO transition and keep me in the leadership role, I would guarantee her fund a board seat on any future committees related to M&A or financing decisions, giving her direct oversight on exit strategy. She asked 2 questions, both about the financial projections. I answered them. Then she said she would support me. The second VC firm was harder. They held 9%, and their lead partner was a man named David Huang who had a reputation for being ruthlessly pragmatic and deeply skeptical of founder-led companies at scale. I could not appeal to his loyalty. He had none. I could not appeal to his vision. He didn't care about vision, only returns, so I appealed to his self-interest. I scheduled a call with him on Sunday evening and told him I was going to block the CEO transition, that I had secured enough votes to prevent Richard from forcing me out, and that the board was about to fracture into 2 camps, those who supported the founder and those who supported Richard's plan. I explained that a fractured board would create operational paralysis, tank employee morale, spook our enterprise clients, and destroy any chance of a successful exit. Then I offered him a deal. If he voted with me, I would agree to bring in a president and chief operating officer, not a CEO, but a strong operational leader who could address the board's concerns about scale, and I would give his firm the right to approve the final candidate. He would get the operational leadership he wanted without the political fallout of removing the founder. He asked for 24 hours to think about it. I gave him 12. He called back Monday morning and said he was in. That gave me 58% of the voting power. I had control. But control was not enough. I needed to ensure that Richard could never attempt this again, and that meant changing the structural dynamics of the board itself. On Monday afternoon, I met with our general counsel in a conference room off-site. Her name was Melissa Tran, and she had been with the company for 3 years. She was smart, competent, and politically careful. She had survived by never picking sides, always framing her advice as neutral legal guidance and aligning with whoever held power at any given moment. I did not trust her. But I needed her. I told her I was going to propose a governance restructure at the next board meeting, adding 2 seats, one independent director with deep operational experience in enterprise software and one employee representative selected by the executive team. Both seats would dilute the VC voting power proportionally, shifting the balance further toward founder control and making it mathematically impossible for Richard to force any major decision without my approval. Then I told Melissa that if she supported the restructure and helped me draft the amendments to the shareholder agreement, I would promote her to Chief Legal Officer with expanded responsibilities and a significant equity refresh. If she did not support it, I would replace her within 60 days. She asked if I was serious. I was. The restructure required a majority vote of the existing board, which I now had, but it also required amendments to the shareholder agreement, which meant legal documentation, investor approvals, and at least 3 days of drafting and review. Melissa worked through Tuesday and Wednesday, and by Thursday morning we had a full proposal package: governance restructure, board seat additions, updated shareholder agreement, and a slate of candidates for the new independent director role. I also had a second document, one that Melissa did not draft and did not know existed. It was a formal complaint filed with the Washington State Securities Division, alleging that Richard had breached his fiduciary duty as a board member by recruiting CEO candidates and soliciting votes for a leadership change without disclosing a conflict of interest. Specifically, that he had a personal relationship with one of the CEO candidates he was recommending, a former colleague from his days at a large private equity firm. The complaint included email evidence, meeting notes, and a timeline showing that Richard had been planning the transition for at least 4 months without ever disclosing the relationship to the board or to me. The evidence was real. I had obtained it through a combination of public records requests, LinkedIn forensics, and a private investigator I hired on Monday who specialized in corporate governance disputes. I did not plan to file the complaint unless I needed to, but I had it ready. The board meeting started at 9 on Thursday. Richard opened by asking if I had considered the CEO transition proposal. I said I had and that I was declining the offer. I thanked the board for their feedback, acknowledged the concerns about operational scale, and proposed an alternative. I would remain as CEO, we would hire a president and COO with enterprise experience to oversee day-to-day operations, and we would restructure the board to add 2 seats, one independent director with operational expertise and one employee representative, to ensure broader perspectives and reduce the risk of groupthink. I presented the governance proposal, the amended shareholder agreement, and the candidate slate. Then I called for a vote. Richard objected immediately. He said the proposal was premature, that we needed more time to evaluate candidates, that adding board seats would dilute investor control and create governance challenges. He argued that the original CEO transition plan was the right path forward and that the board should vote on it today. I let him finish. Then I asked Angela and David if they had any questions about the governance proposal. They both said no. I called the vote. Angela voted yes, David voted yes. The third VC firm abstained. They had not been part of my coalition and were clearly uncomfortable picking sides. Richard and his firm voted no. The independent director voted yes, breaking the tie. The governance restructure passed. Richard's face went white. He asked for a recess, claiming he needed to consult with his firm's legal team. I denied the request. We moved to the next agenda item, the CEO transition proposal. Richard called for a vote to approve the transition and install a new CEO. I called for a countervote to reject the proposal and affirm my continued role as CEO. Angela voted to reject. David voted to reject. The third VC firm voted to reject. They had seen the way the wind was blowing and were not going to back a failed coup. The independent director voted to reject. Richard and his firm voted to approve the transition, but they were in the minority. The proposal failed. Richard stood up, said this was a mistake, said the company would suffer under my continued leadership, and walked out of the meeting. The other board members sat in silence. I adjourned the meeting, thanked everyone for their time, and scheduled a follow-up session for the following week to begin the COO search process. Richard did not resign from the board immediately. He stayed on for 6 weeks, attending meetings but contributing nothing, clearly trying to figure out his next move. During that time, I executed the rest of the plan. I hired a president and COO, a woman named Karen Delgado who had spent 15 years at Salesforce and Oracle and had exactly the operational credibility the board wanted. I added the 2 new board seats, bringing in an independent director with deep SaaS experience and an employee representative who was our VP of engineering. I restructured the executive team, promoted 3 senior leaders who had been loyal and effective, and quietly encouraged 2 others who had aligned with Richard to pursue opportunities elsewhere. And I filed the securities complaint. Not publicly, just with the state regulator, requesting a confidential review of Richard's actions during the CEO transition attempt. The complaint did not result in formal charges, but it did result in an investigation, and the existence of that investigation became known to the other board members through informal channels. Richard's reputation took a hit. His firm's relationship with other portfolio companies became strained. And 3 months later, he quietly stepped down from our board, citing scheduling conflicts and strategic priorities. His firm retained its equity stake, but Richard was gone. The company grew. We hit our 4th quarter targets, exceeded our annual revenue goals, and signed 2 major enterprise contracts in the 1st quarter of the following year. Karen proved to be exactly the operational leader we needed. She built processes, scaled the team, and took the administrative burden off my shoulders so I could focus on product strategy and client relationships. The board stabilized. The employees saw that I had fought for the company and won, and morale improved. And 18 months later, we raised a Series C round at a $320 million valuation, bringing in new investors who had no relationship to Richard and no interest in forcing a premature exit. We were on track for an IPO in 2 years. I never spoke to Richard again after he left the board. I would see his name occasionally in industry news. He raised a new fund. He joined the board of another startup. He gave a keynote at a conference about scaling venture-backed companies. But he never mentioned me, and I never mentioned him. The story of what happened in that boardroom stayed private, known only to the people who were there and the few advisors I had consulted during the 7-day preparation period. I did not write a blog post about it. I did not give interviews about founder resilience or board dynamics. I simply moved forward, built the company, and proved that the board had made the right decision by keeping me in place. But I never forgot what Richard tried to do, and I never forgot how close he came to succeeding. He had underestimated me, assumed that because I was a founder, I would be emotional, reactive, unable to play the long game or execute a sophisticated counter-strategy. He assumed that I would accept the humiliation, take the CPO role, and fade into irrelevance while he positioned himself as the power behind the company. He was wrong. I was not emotional, I was calculating, I was not reactive, I was strategic. And I was not going to let someone take the company I built simply because they had more board experience and better relationships with other investors. I fought back with precision, patience, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to win, and I won. Not by making noise, not by appealing to fairness, but by understanding power, building alliances, and executing a plan so clean that by the time Richard realized what was happening, he had already lost. That is the lesson I carry with me now as CEO of a company approaching $500 million in valuation. Power is not given, it is taken, and the people who try to take it from you will only succeed if you let them. Richard humiliated me in that boardroom, tried to strip me of the role I had earned, and nearly convinced an entire board that I was not capable of leading the company I had founded. But he made one critical mistake: he assumed I would not fight back. And by the time he realized I was fighting, I had already won.